International Idea. I would also like to give a warm welcome to our panelists joining us today. Catalina Uribe, who is a program officer at International Idea and a co-author of the report being discussed today. I'm also joined by Annette Idler, the Director of Studies at Oxford University Changing Character of War Program. And finally, we're joined today by Timothy Sisk, who is a professor at Denver University at Josef Korbel School of International Studies. Before we start, I'd like to just say that International Idea is an intergovernmental organization working to support democracy worldwide. We have 29 member states around the world, and more information about IDEA can be found at our website, idea.int. We started working on the issue of protecting politics in 2009 by the initiative of the government of Mexico. And more recently, under this project, we've launched 4 papers on organized crime and its impact on service delivery, local democracy, elections, political parties, together with the Klingendal Institute and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Today, we're going to talk about the topic of one of these reports, which are showing them to the camera here, namely the one on local democracy that we produced together in partnership with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Before we start, I would like to do a bit of housekeeping for the webinar. For those of you tweeting today, please use the hashtag #ProtectingPolitics. And as you might be aware of, this is the second webinar in the series of 4 webinars covering the papers. We had the first webinar last week on organized crime and service delivery. And I would like to take this opportunity to invite you for the 2 upcoming webinars. The one on organized crime and election is broadcasting on the 1st of November, and the 4th and final webinar is broadcast on the 8th of November and will be the topic of political parties and organized crime. In addition, I'd like to invite you to join us for the launch of the 4 papers here at International Ideas headquarters on the 29th of November, where we will be joined by IDEA Secretary General Yves Leterme and the report's co-authors, Tuesday Retano, Diana Goff, and Catalina Uribe. All this information, including the 4 reports, is available on the website, and we'll also share with you the link to this page via the webinar chat after this webinar. I'd also like to mention quickly that the recording for this webinar will be made available online in about a week's time from now. Finally, to ask questions and participate in the Q&A session, which is located at the end of this hour, please use the question tab on the right-hand side of the right-hand tab on the screen throughout the event, because we will select a couple of your questions and post them to our panelists in the end. So I would encourage you to participate and ask throughout the presentations. Before I'll hand over to the panelists, we would like to do a brief poll with you. We want to know where you're located and where your background is. And you'll have around 20 seconds per question to respond. Should I launch it now? Sorry, I'm going to launch the poll here. Yeah, here. So I have it. So the first question is, where are you located? And you'll be able to respond Europe, Asia Pacific, Africa, South America, and North America. I'll give you 5 more seconds, and then before going into the second question. Okay, closing that question now, and then we'll ask you what your background is and give you around 20 seconds to answer that one. Where do I see the results? Okay, I hope you all had time to respond. I'm now closing the poll, and okay, and I will share the results with you now, both of the results. Okay, and as you can, I can only see question 2. Yeah, as you can see on the last question, we are about 60% working in international or regional organizations. Unfortunately, I can't seem to pop up this first question. Let me see. This is, high tech is great. So we're 44% from Europe, and then we are 33% from South America, 11% from North America, and 11% from Africa. Unfortunately, no one from Asia Pacific is joining us, but it's understandable due to the time difference. So hope you enjoy this one. I would now like to hand over to our first presenter, but before that, I will just briefly run you through today's program, which will start by a presentation by Catalina Uribe, who's going to talk to us about the nexus of organized crime and local democracy. This will then be followed by a presentation from Annette Idler about organized crime, and in particular, the case of Colombia. Last but not least, we will also have a presentation by Timothy Sisk, who will talk about local elections and local democracy and local elections related violence. And looking forward to that one. And then finally, and as I mentioned in the beginning, we will conclude the webinar with a short Q&A questions based on the interactions from the audience. So we'll now give the floor to Catalina.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me just pop up the presentation. Yes. Okay, thank you very much for this invitation and to Melida for the kind introduction. I think, well, it's quite timely to be talking about this issue today. As you know, for the first time in human history, most of us are living in urban settlements. And I was reading in The Guardian earlier this year how the total area covered by the world's cities is set to triple in the next 40 years. So this is certainly a timely issue, particularly when it comes to how local governments deal with insecurity, criminality in general, and organized criminality in particular. And indeed, we know that organized crime has special interest in the local level. Just in the 2014 regional elections in Peru, for example, the Ministry of the announced that 124 candidates maintained links with illicit drug trafficking networks. And 14% of those were finally elected. So there is something about the local level. And mayors around the world are grappling with this issue. Just yesterday, I was reading how Bogotá's mayor, Enrique Peñalosa, was defending his recent crackdown on the Bronx, one of the city's most crime and drug-affected neighborhoods. And what is most obscure about how organized crime operates at the local level is the issue of political corruption. Because while corruption by nature is an obscure issue, but also because the local in particularly has very little spotlight, very little attention from the media. And in general, oversight agencies struggle to operate across the country in many of these places. And the problem is that organized crime has most of its interest at the local level. It is there where they need to control key border regions, as I think Annette will later explain, but also strategic ports, remote areas where they have fertile ground for production of drugs, for mineral extraction, etc. And so I'll mention sort of the key issues that have to do with local democracy and how organized crime affects the local level in that respect. And the issue with local democracy is that it is this lowest administrative level where arguably local communities and authorities enjoy the closest relationship. It is at that level that citizens supposedly and effectively stand better chances to influence their governments, and where those government authorities are well placed to listen to their constituencies and therefore tailor the provision of services to satisfy those needs. And in that respect, it's remarkable the role that decentralization has played in order to shape those relationships over the past years. In the last 20 years, approximately 80% of countries in the world introduced some type of decentralization measure or power devolution to local authorities. And this has been particularly the case when it comes to conflict-affected and fragile states. If we look at the world, according to Uppsala's country database in the 1990s, 33 countries were affected by conflict in that year. And 18 of those countries underwent some type of power devolution or decentralization process in the years after that. So that really highlights the challenges that some of these countries have faced to introduce these decentralization measures at the same time as they're dealing with these protracted conflict situations. And indeed, decentralization has had some positive results. The Niger case study, for example, highlights how with many caveats, decentralization has arguably contributed to bringing people closer to the state, which is one of the main goals of decentralization, and empowering women and marginalized communities. And again, for this particular topic of today, to improve the system of checks and balances at that level, because, well, the main argument behind decentralization, or one of the main arguments, is that by bringing the state closer to the people, citizens are better placed to hold those authorities accountable. But other cases show a more unbalanced result when it comes to decentralization. And in that regard, the Colombia case study in this paper is very telling. Because in Colombia and in other countries that have suffered or have gone through these decentralization measures, in some localities it has had very positive results. But in others, especially in places that already had lack of technical and financial resources, where there were very strong local patronage and clientelistic systems, decentralization removed a layer of state oversight by national governments that has not always been replaced by citizen-led oversight. And the consequence has been sometimes an intensification of corruption in those localities, where authorities tend to enjoy increased discretion powers vis-a-vis national decision makers that have made, therefore, the system more vulnerable to illicit actors to leverage the system of so-called retail politics, where they can distribute goods and services to their constituencies. And then when you add organized crime to this cocktail, the results can be very toxic. So again, to mention the case of Colombia, in that country that went through a very steep decentralization process in the early 1990s, even though decentralization had very positive results in some localities, for example, nearly 50% of national revenues are now distributed to the local level, and social expenditure increased in relation to the national GDP, and indeed some local governments have been empowered and their capacity increased largely due to the decentralization process. In some isolated communities, the decentralization process arguably exacerbated already existing institutional weaknesses, because authorities did not have the capacity to carry out their new roles and thrived under a system that some scholars labeled arbitration through extortion, where Instead of parties exchanging posts and favors, as it happened before the decentralization process, and that's how corruption worked before, afterwards, it was often secured through kidnapping and extortion. And the results were quite devastating. Between 1998 and 2002, more than 500 public officials were killed, and illegal networks reportedly controlled over 35% of governor's office after the 2011 local elections. And governance as such was weakened. 18 municipalities that went bankrupt between 1999 and 2011 in Colombia had electoral results favoring candidates with close links to paramilitary groups and organized crime networks. And besides exacerbating corruption, decentralization also had other undesired results because then it further hinders, in some of these cases, political contestation, because as power sort of concentrates in the hands of local elites, it becomes harder for the outsiders to enter politics under a level playing field. And furthermore, it may contribute to violence, because while in centralized systems, well, these systems offer a comfortable solution for organized crime to protect their interests in the form of protection outsourcing, whereby the state, through its nationally controlled security forces, protects organized crime. In decentralized systems, organized criminals have to deal with too many intermediaries. So that has, in some cases, created an incentive for them to create their own private armies, and because that's easier and cheaper, and then you add another violent actor to the local level. But we have to highlight that that's not always been the case, and centralized systems also have struggled to control the influence of organized crime at the local level. And in that respect, the Afghanistan case study in this paper is quite telling. Afghanistan, as you probably know, and when you read the paper you will see, it's one of the most centralized states in the world, as it was sort of structured after the 2004 constitution. But Adam Rodriguez, the case study author in the paper, describes how organized crime with that system has thrived. Because, well, on the one hand, you have local governments that are formally weak because it's a very centralized system, but also you have a national government that is equally inexistent in much of the country. So, for example, the author provides the example of the Nimruz province in Afghanistan, where the state has never provided a provincial reconstruction team, which are the entities responsible for coordinating international and national security activity at the provincial level. So just as an example, so that lack of state presence combined with very powerful local power brokers, in that case warlords who have remained the dominant informal local power holders, who don't face the same controls as formal authorities, has allowed for some of them, together with organized crime, to maintain a strong foothold in the country's opium production and trafficking areas, like the provinces of Helmand and Kandahar. And this has furthermore had devastating consequences for the country. Right now, Afghanistan, as you probably know, is the world's unchallenged leader in opium production and trafficking, and UNODC estimates that this trafficking generates between $100 and $155 million in annual revenues for the Taliban, which is over a quarter of their annual profits. So these two examples of very centralized and decentralized systems highlight that the bottom line aspect when it comes to curbing political corruption linked to organized crime is, first of all, the capacity that local authorities have to respond to citizens' needs, as well as the accountability mechanisms that state authorities and citizens have to control the power structures at that level. So, well, this is sort of a bit of a taste of what this report contains, and yeah, I look forward to Annette's and team's reactions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catalina, for this very interesting presentation. I'll now hand over to Annette Idler, who's going to present to us the case of Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Can you just give me a sign if you hear me?
I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, great.
Yes.
Good. Well, thank you very much for this invitation, and thanks so much for sharing the report with me, which I read obviously with great detail. And what I would like to do now is just give the point of view from Colombia's peripheries, because there are many elements in the report that are actually reflected in what's going on in that region. So to start with, Colombia's peripheries are very much affected by organized crime because of the strategic location. So these are the areas that have been the strategic sites of operation of the main conflict actors in Colombia, so the rebel groups, but also the paramilitaries. And at the same time, there are the corridors of the international trafficking routes. So the starting points of international routes towards the US, for example, are located at the Pacific coast, and the starting points of the trafficking routes to West Africa and then to Europe, but also via the Caribbean to the US are in the Caribbean coast. Now, this means that these regions are strategic sites for conflict actors and organized criminals. There are three specific characteristics that make them so prone for organized crime. First of all, the weak state governance systems. Catalina has mentioned already or highlighted the effect of decentralization in the Colombian case. And what we see in those border areas is that here services, state capacities are particularly deficient despite the decentralization. We also see a lack of accountability, which means that those spaces are particularly prone to impunity. And this is because they are, by definition, an international border. So if, for example, criminals commit crimes on one side of the border, they can easily just cross the border and escape the law enforcement authorities. At the same time, those areas are also very attractive because they feature a low-risk, high-opportunity environment. And by that, I really mean that there are two different economic systems that meet at borders, which is what makes, well, on the one hand, legal commerce, but especially illegal cross-border activities, trafficking, particularly lucrative at those border areas. So this is really why looking at those peripheries is particularly insightful if we want to understand the relationship, the nexus between organized crime and local politics. Now, I think it's important to come back to one of the points made in the report, which is that the nexus between organized crime and politics at the local level is really an issue of mutual benefit. And just to confirm that point, I'd like to share this quote with you, one of the informants that I interviewed when I was carrying out research in those border areas. And that person was saying, here you can't distinguish the illegal actor from the legal actor, from the state, because there is no state. Because when you talk about the state, you also talk about the citizens. State actors do not represent the state. They form part of the state apparatus of the Colombian state, but sometimes the majority of their activities are illegal. So why do I mention this quote here? Really to show that I think it's not useful to make the dichotomy between what is the upper world and what is the underworld, but that we should look at those relationships in a different way. And this is also one of the points that was highlighted in the report, the different arrangements that exist between organized criminals and politicians. Now, what I do in my work is I look at this going one step back. I look at this arguing that rather than having an alliance between state and non-state, we have alliances of different types of arrangements of convenience, as I call them, in general between different actors, and that can be both state actors and non-state actors. So I'm using a typology that I've established in previous work on non-state actors, non-state armed groups, because it actually also applies to looking at those relationships between politics on the one hand and organized crime on the other hand in the Colombian case. So the first one is preponderance relations, and I'd like to give just a brief example for each of those cases. Here what we can see, for example, in Samaniego, in Nariño, is that organized criminals or conflict actors, and this is so unique about Colombia where the two converge in a certain way, where they've achieved to kind of infiltrate the local government. Another example is Arauca, and just to give you an example of that, here on the map that you see on the screen, you see illicit flights. These are flights, basically cocaine shipments that start in the south, in that case Apure, Venezuelan Apure, towards Central America and then going further to the US. Now, as you can see here, Apure is just next to Arauca, and Arauca right now is very much controlled by the ELN, the second largest rebel group in Colombia. Now, this map shows you why it is so important to control that area. Well, because it's strategic on the trafficking route. It's also strategic for other forms of transnational organized crime, gasoline smuggling, for example, basically all the goods that leave Colombia via Venezuela, but also other goods that are smuggled from Venezuela to Colombia. So in that case, it's really the convergence of those conflict actors and organized crime, how organized crime is used as an income source to explain why they would try and take control of that of the local authorities, while the state is very much absent and state services are deficient in that particular department of Colombia. Now, the second case is strategic alliances, and this is really when both, on the one hand, organized criminals or conflict actors engage in an alliance with the political actors, which ultimately, by doing so, become criminal actors as well. It means that they share information, they might share intelligence, they might try to just work together and join forces to fight a third party or to gain more benefit. And one example that is highlighted in the report, also mentioned by Catalina, is obviously the parapolitics scandal, which was very strong in Cesar, in the department of Cesar, where paramilitaries have joined forces with politicians. But we also see more recent examples in La Guajira, for example. And here I'd like to just mention the case of alias Marquitos, who was captured in October 2014. He was what I call in my work a narco broker. So he was an intermediary between the different rebel groups, paramilitary groups, and criminal groups, but he also very much allied with political actors. He was supposed to be the right hand of the former governor of La Guajira, as mentioned in this media excerpt that you see on the screen. So he managed to have control over local drug trafficking and gasoline smuggling, and this there was shed light on those cases in October 2014 when he was detained. And this just shows the alliance that very much exists at the local level in La Guajira in this case. And the third case, or the third type of arrangement of convenience that we see, especially in those marginalized areas in Colombia, is what I call Pacific coexistence. And this is what's least seen, and I think this is something that could maybe also come out stronger in the report, because here we don't necessarily see violence and we don't see a strategic alliance. We really see how different actors coexist in the same territory. So they often have tacit agreements of non-aggression that just let each other operate along each other in that territory. An example here is Ocaña, a city in North Santander. And as you can see on this map here, Ocaña is located on a really strategic point close to the border with Venezuela. So this is where the precursor flows go through in order then the precursors that are used to process coca into cocaine. But it's also where, on the other hand, gasoline flows come from Venezuela and enter Colombia. So it's a very important point where many have an interest in. On the one hand, different rebel groups, because it's also close to the coca cultivation. On the other hand, right-wing groups, the follow-up groups after the demobilization of the paramilitaries, and also smaller criminal groups. Now, at the time when I was doing my research, there weren't any incidents of homicides, there weren't any armed struggles, there weren't many violent clashes. That was in 2012, because basically the different groups were operating while the local authorities didn't really get involved. So there was knowledge of their presence, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would attack directly. There was a kind of coexistence between those different actors. And then finally, the third type of arrangement that I think is very important to highlight in the Colombian case are short-term arrangements that exist between political actors and criminal actors. And here another example to highlight is Tumaco, which you can see here at the Pacific coast on this map. Now, Tumaco is the very strategic starting point of international trafficking routes towards the US. It's a harbor town, it's at the Pacific coast, and all the gasoline flows, the drug flows, they all converge towards Tumaco. Now, in that case, both political actors and criminal actors try to take advantage and basically benefit from the lucrative drug trade. And this is why they engage in very short-lived alliances that might break down very quickly. That can mean that, for example, political actors subcontract smaller criminal groups in order to get rid of a political rival. It can also mean that they share intelligence against operations of by the state, so the national state versus the local authorities. And it can also mean that they just share intelligence to make sure that it can use certain trafficking routes. So what I'd like to show with those different types of arrangements that we see, and with the case of Colombia, is really that the claim that is made in the report about the nexus between organized crime and politics is very much there, and it's particularly strong at the local level. Now, in the case of Colombia, what it shows is that marginalization, which is the case in those border areas that I've researched for a long time, it exacerbates the entanglements of relations between conflict and organized crime actors. And then secondly, what we also see is that improving the capacity of local authorities and democratic spaces is particularly important in Colombia's peripheries because of the weak state governance systems. And then finally, to conclude with, the absence of violence does not necessarily mean the absence of organized crime. And I think this is particularly important to highlight, because one of the points in the report obviously is that organized crime can exacerbate or deteriorate the situation, the insecurity situation, by fueling more violence. But at the same time, it can also mean that even though there's no violence, organized crime can very much operate. And this is really where we need to pay most attention to in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette, for a very interesting presentation and very useful typology, which I think we will discuss at the Q&A again. I'd like now to hand over to Timothy Sisk, who's going to share with us the last presentation for today before we head into the discussion at the end. Thank you, and welcome, Tim.
Particularly is this kind of a typology of ways of connection that we might think about political hijack as one way, the sort of Pacific coexistence that was mentioned, strategic alliances, etc. So it's quite interesting. My presentation will actually sort of bridge between this report on protecting politics as it relates to local democracy and another report from the same series on protecting politics and particularly deterring the influence of organized crime in electoral processes. So what I'd like to do is just briefly go through the kind of what we know or what we think we know about the relationship between local elections and organized crime. And as Annette mentioned, not all of these relationships lead to violence, but what we've seen in many situations globally is that this close connection or nexus between local authorities and organized crime has led to violence in a number of contexts. I'd like to begin essentially with a look at a number of contexts where we see this sort of close connection between local elections, organized crime, and election-related violence. So the three vignettes that I have here on this slide are all out of the just in the last 6 months or so. So we find that even just this past weekend from the local elections in Brazil, and particularly in the areas of Rio, the deployment of extensive security forces because of the concern about the relationship between local actors and local criminal groups, and this expectation of violence in the Brazil context led to this deployment. Now, interesting was following up on that over the past couple of days, and perhaps in part because of the deployment, there were lower levels of violence than was anticipated. South Africa had local elections in July of this year, and in the run-up to those elections, there were about 15 fatalities, mostly in the KwaZulu region of South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal. And a lot of this type of violence was very interesting. It was mostly intra-party, so within the ANC, this level of political assassination in this particular area, again within the political party, has been around sort of capturing local authority, and so it's very much related to some of the issues in the report around how, capture, which Catalina also mentioned, capture of a local authority means that you then have access to contracts, have access to distribution of goods, other things, revenues, jobs that place a real premium on gaining control of that local authority. And then the Philippines, of course, is yet another case. And here we've seen over many, many electoral cycles since democratization in the Philippines in the late 1980s, has been this problem of local level violence. Now, the most recent in the Philippines saw, as you can see from the headline here, around 50 fatalities, and this is actually a lower number than has historically been the case in the Philippines. But in the Philippines, then one has this sort of concept of the RIDO, which is, clan-based conflict at the local level. And again, it's a question of control over those local authorities. So it raises this broader question, which we've seen around the world, around elections being conflict-inducing. And the question is that we have seen often, particularly at the local level, political violence that can escalate well before a conflict, like well before the electoral process, up to 18 months or so, as local actors begin to do things like raise campaign finances through kidnapping or extortion or other things, all the way through, as it was suggested by some of those headlines, political violence in the sort of campaign period, and then also political violence at the local level we've also seen in post-electoral contexts. For example, in Kenya in 2007-2008, where much of the violence that was related to the national elections actually played out in local areas, particularly in the Rift Valley and in the urban areas. So this slide I particularly wanted to highlight, we have all these theories, and International IDEA has a very good elections risk management tool, which will take users through all of the different types of mobilization dynamics and ways that these conflicts escalate, particularly at the local level. So we can see that at times, for example, in Karachi, Pakistan, we've seen sort of ethnic or sectarian differences be the sort of, quote, root cause. As I mentioned with regard to the Philippines, then often clans and clientelism and patronage of politics, factionalism is an issue. Around local elections, and this is, I think, the key point of the presentation, what we've seen is both Catalina and Annette have mentioned in various cases in terms of the report, but also, as Annette mentioned with regard to Colombia, that we've seen this kind of access to state resources and the ability to win control of a local government gives one control of local territory, as in the case of Colombia, or in the ability to distribute to distribute rents, for example, from natural resources in the case of Nigeria, where local contests are often about, again, control, over distribution resources. So in some of the work on South Africa, for example, what we've seen are the, 3 different types of local electoral processes, or 3 different ways in which political violence has been seen. One, and probably most common, is this issue of political assassinations. Secondly, around local protests and so-called no-go zones, where candidates from other parties can't enter particular areas without fear for their lives. And then, as I suggested with regard to South Africa, here what we've seen is a conflict that occurs within political parties. So at the local level, if you can be the candidate of the the ruling party, the party that's expected to win, then that is a very high premium on that position. And so what we've seen is some of this has been very much intra-party. So some of these other factors here at the national level, we've also seen at the local level. That is often, the question of a winner-take-all system at the local level is highly problematic, again, because if you can control that one, sort of mayoral position, then you're likely to make yourself very, very rich. So some of the things that the risk management tool has us looking at are all of the factors that you can see here, and I can't go through all of them in this very short presentation, but these are exactly the kinds of issues that one would focus on in terms of an electoral process at the national level that will be also very important at the local level. One of the key things about election-related violence at the local level, as it relates to particularly to those instances where non-state actors or vigilante groups or others may be engaged in violence, is that we need a very broad definition of such violence. That in fact, in measuring and monitoring election-related violence, one of the aspects that is very important is intimidation, which is a form of violence, but not directly physical violence. And this has been very common a factor for local authorities as they sort of struggle with intimidation by corrupt or criminal actors. So in conclusion, I would say that the key issue here for the local level in terms of protecting politics is very much part of a strategy of mitigating election-related violence. And as we've seen in other processes, this has to do with, kind of throughout the entire electoral cycle. In other words, if you're monitoring local elections or you're going into a local environment and you come in 3 to 4 weeks prior to the election and expect to be able to, mitigate or prevent conflict, you're typically much too late. For example, in these recent South Africa local elections, there was a lot of upfront work by civil society organizations a full year in advance of these elections to try to prevent a broader violence. So these are some of the factors here. I can't go through all of them. 2 of them that I would like to mention is one is the fostering social cohesion. And from research in different areas, what we've learned is that these sort of local, what the UN Development Program would call architectures for peace, local peace committees, local NGOs that monitor conditions at the local level, have really close-in knowledge of these relationships among actors. That these networks are the ones, local civil society groups, that are able to best respond to incidents of escalating violence. And so this becomes very important to think through these sort of local level architectures for peace as it relates to preventing election-related violence at the local level. The last one is this question of social media, where we've seen very interesting processes, coming out of Kenya, but many other places where social media is used by the public to report on instances of intimidation, of extortion, kidnapping, etc. that may be related to an electoral process. So I think there's a new avenue here around social accountability and citizen monitoring to prevent violence at the local level that may be related to criminal enterprise. So I mentioned quite a few cases. This issue of local elections and local violence and connections to criminal networks we've seen in many other places, Mexico, Guatemala, Afghanistan, as was mentioned, Jamaica, Colombia, as Annette pointed out, Cambodia, Peru, Kenya, which I mentioned, which has also gone through extensive decentralization. So this is a considerable issue and one that hopefully many actors will take on, regional organizations, civil society groups, as an important area of work, both in democracy and in conflict management. So thank you very much for your attention. Great.
Thank you, Tim, for this. It was a very interesting presentation, and I'm happy that you ended it talking a little bit about how civil society organization at the local level can contribute to strengthening local democracy, but also how social media can serve as yet another tool for monitoring and kind of supporting institutions and processes at the local level. And we're now going to move into the question and answers part of this webinar, and we have received some questions here, and just give me a second while I'll dig out the questions. Okay, so we have a couple of questions, and I'm going to direct this question to Annette, who was talking about Colombia and the peripheries in that country. There is a question coming in here from participants where someone's asking, while the problems with borders are known for years, why aren't governments able to control them? So this is a bit of a general question, but maybe something that the case of Colombia can help us understand. Please unmute yourself when you respond. Thank you. Annette, sorry, can you unmute yourself? We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for this question. So on why governments can't control their border areas even though this is known. Well, I mean, the case of Colombia really shows, obviously, the territory is hard to access, and it's very much expanded, but it also very much depends on the political will. So often, the rationale is that, well, the votes are located in the urban areas, in the case of Colombia, Cali, Medellin, Bogota, whereas the more marginalized areas obviously have a less dense population. However, the Colombian case also shows that those areas are the strongholds of the insurgent groups. These are the areas where the grievances are most severe, which is why there should be an interest in controlling those areas. So I think it's really a question of the political will, of understanding that even though the votes might be located or concentrated in the more central areas, long term, if we think about sustainable peace, if we think about sustainable development for the entire country, it's very much important to invest in those areas. And that relates obviously also to the embedment in the international context. Borders by definition are, those border spaces are transnational, and they need to be regulated by both sides of the border. So it's also about making sure that there is cooperation between both sides of the border. So at the local level, if it's too difficult at the national level, that can happen at the local level through an exchange of information, through giving incentives for trade, commercial relations, but also through cross-border civil society organizations and actors like the church that can promote that investment in those border areas. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that answer. And I think the answer illustrates the complexity of border issues with many different actors, both transnational, national, local, but also across different groups in society, and how all of these kind of need to work together. So thank you very much for that answer. I'll now move on to a question which I will direct mainly to Catalina, but I will also encourage the two panelists, the two other panelists, to add if there's anything. The second question actually has to do about the data collection for the studies carried out. I guess this is also concerned kind of the research that Annette was presenting. How and the question is basically, how was the data collected, and what kind of security-related elements did you have to take into consideration in order to gather information on this topic of organized crime? So I'll hand over to Catalina now, and then feel free to add also the other panelists. Just kind of, you know, give me a hint, so then I'll put you on mute. Thank you.
Yeah, no, this issue, well, both, well, thanks so much for the question. It is, as you guys know, one of the most complicated aspects of doing any work when it comes to organized crime is security, and political corruption, even more difficult to carry out field research. So throughout this project, not only for these 4 reports, but even before, we started this, as Melida mentioned, in 2009, and part of the research I conducted, for example, in 2012 in Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, was part of the well, the fellowship on drugs, security, and democracy by the Social Science Research Council. And there is a strong component of how to carry out this research under like security considerations. So a lot of these case studies were documented, well, part of it by open sources, media articles, judicial reports, etc. But also part of it was gathered through direct interviews in the capitals, but also in the municipalities where these cases were documented. So a related product that this sort of is a spin-off of is the 2013 book on illicit networks and politics in Latin America. And in that report, we have case studies on Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, but also Guatemala and Honduras. And there, I and other researchers who worked on this had to consider, for example, well, first of all, who we are interviewing, in what places, and many are anonymous sources. So unfortunately, we can't always disclose who we are talking to. We are always talking to high-level civil society organizations, governmental officials, etc. But it's not always possible to disclose their names, because they also have to stay there and face the security environment that is not always conducive to revealing their names. So that's from my side, and I'm sure Annette has a lot to say about doing this type of work.
Thank you for this, Catalina. And Annette, please add, but very quickly, because I have one more question then for Tim later.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, just very quickly to add, I just wanted to emphasize that it's very, very important not just to think about the researcher's security, but really of those people who are involved on the ground. And in my case, for example, I did fieldwork in Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela. I carried out more than 500 interviews now over the past 6 years in those areas. And the important thing is, on one hand, for the data to triangulate, so really to talk to different local stakeholders to make sure that there is actually validity of the information, but then also on the other hand, really make sure that those people that we are talking to are feeling comfortable about that, and that they don't feel threatened by that kind of information. And then also, obviously, trying to give something back by contributing also to hopefully making the situation on the ground better.
Okay, thank you very much for this, Annette. Do you want to add something quickly, Tim, or can...
Yes, thanks, Melita. Just on this question of data, this is a very difficult area, of course. Most of what we know about, for example, the effect of organized crime on local elections and the relationship to election-related violence, it comes from local case studies, from very close-in analysis by academics, the civil society, and the media, in part because it's very difficult to know, okay, say that particular, political assassination that makes the news in a place like KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, to really understand the extent to which was this a sort of a criminal assassination related to, sort of bad business going wrong, or was it, explicitly political or related to the electoral process, almost as a case-by-case consideration. And so we don't have a sort of a global database by which we can monitor these trends. Most of it, you'll see that, getting into these issues becomes really a close-in case study of a particular locality or a particular event or analysis that comes that way. So it's often whom we rely upon for these are human rights monitoring organizations. For example, Human Rights Watch has done extensive work in Nigeria right around these issues. So the data and understanding the relationships is an exceptionally challenging area. It's true for particularly for those engaged in democracy building, like international or local election monitors. So it's a very good question and a very sort of challenging issue to focus on in this area.
Thank you very much, Tim, for this edition. And I think every one of us who works with democracy-related elements at the local level know how, the need for data and for comparative data available out there. While I actually had one more question from the audience, unfortunately, due to lack of time, I won't be able to post it to the panelists, but I will kind of post it to as an end to this webinar, because I think this builds a lot on what was presented, and it's also something I'm sure that the two experts joining us today and Catalina, who's working in the Protecting Politics project, can continue to discuss as they move ahead in this project. And basically, the question from the audience is, or from a participant is, what is the first step to begin with this decentralization? And how do we convince people in power to share this power or to take a step back? And I think, as I just mentioned, 2 minutes, it's not enough to answer this question, but I do hope that this at least can lead us to be aware that there are very intriguing things still to be discussed and still to be kind of elaborated upon from academia, from local actors, from national actors, from international organizations, and so on. I'd also like to say just quickly that this was a very interesting webinar from my end. That I really enjoyed it. We discussed many different things. We discussed the elements of decentralization, local democracy, the cases of Colombia, and a useful new way to look at typologies rather to not get stuck into kind of a dichotomy between like informal or formal or non-state actors or state actors. I think that is very useful for us, and I think both the three presentations also left us with a hint that actually institutional design of decentralization is very important, and we actually might have to look into diversifying that. That for certain geographical areas, we might need to have specific decentralization design kind of solutions taking place. So it might not be so that you can hit one country with one decentralization policy and be happy with that, because as we know here in the presentations, we saw that organized crime, they tend to kind of take that opportunity and exaggerate the weaknesses at institutional level or border problems. So I think I leave everyone with these kind of small points, and I would like to thank the panelists and the participants for joining us today. We really appreciate this, and we hope that we will be able to continue this discussion in other forums. I'd also like to thank our colleagues here at International IDEA, Helena Schwertheim and Tim Johansson, for organizing the webinars and the technical assistance for this. And I'd also like to remind you to register for the 2 upcoming webinars on 1st of November and 8th of November, where we're going to talk about political parties and organized crime and elections. I don't know if you can see it, but kind of a live showing of these papers. Lastly, I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and thanks again for joining us. Wishing you a reminding good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.